Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Russia's War by Jade McGlynn, narrated by Jade McGlynn. To my Ukrainian friends, colleagues, and heroes. Prologue. Credence and Incredulity. There is a grave in Mariupol, overflowing with human bodies, murdered in cold blood by execution squads. None of the people had been properly identified. Most never would be now. We can already see that there's quite a large number of corpses here. Locals say that uniformed soldiers came in cars and dumped the bodies into these pre-dug trenches. The mayor, Konstantin Ivashchenko, frowns as he explains, in clipped language, that some of the corpses were not properly covered. When Mayor Ivashchenko, who is a local man, stops talking, his eyes are void. The television camera crew turn off their equipment and leave the ruins of a city stalked by cholera and crime. The following day, this clip spreads across Russian mainstream and social media. It makes a strong impression on viewers who watch it in horror. They feel the same revulsion as Western audiences do when watching footage from Mariupol. Some are moved to act, or to turn away, or to despair, or to take the fight to the monsters responsible. Almost all share a hatred of those who murdered these poor souls and glazed the traumatized eyes of the Ukrainian mayor. They share a profound sense of outrage at the foreign-backed criminals killing innocents in Ukraine. Zelensky and his Western-backed Nazis. As a listener, you are probably thinking, nonsense, the Russians killed them. I agree, and there's plenty of evidence to support our assertions. And yet, we haven't been to the crime scene, carried out a full investigation, or developed the expertise to assess when these people were killed and when their bodies were transported to the mass grave. Our knowledge that the Russians are culpable, rather than the Ukrainians, is based on informed assumptions and the wise decision not to give any credence to the claims of Russian news or collaborationist mayors like Ivashchenko. But Russians do give credence to these sources, or at least few give any credence to Western and Ukrainian views. For many of us watching the daily onslaught in Ukraine in horror, the Russian viewpoint is incomprehensible, as baffling as it is appalling. But if we look more closely at the powerful forces shaping those perceptions, the reasons why Russians back the war become much clearer, if no less disconcerting. On the 24th of February 2022, Russia launched a genocidal war against a peaceful neighbour. The violence the Russian army has unleashed is calamitous for Ukraine, the world, and Russia itself. There can be no justification for what Russia is doing now, or for what it has been doing in Ukraine since 2014. And yet many Russians do justify, even approve the war. It is their war, Russia's war, not Putin's alone. I respect the brave Russians who have actively opposed the invasion and worked tirelessly to support Ukrainians in often unacknowledged ways. They possess unfathomable courage. But this book is not about them. Nor is it about the true believers, the soldiers committing atrocities. Neither are representative groups. Instead, it is about the Russians who acquiesced to the war, the ordinary people, the majority. I have zero hope of solving the Russia enigma with a neat label. But I do want to probe the complexities of the context through which these same Russians understand their war. Russian approval of the war is honed by the paradoxical nature of Russian society, the mixture of militarized ritual and apathy that the Kremlin has sponsored and delivered through narratives that resonate in different ways with different groups. Since 2014, the Kremlin and its supporters have devised an entire strategic language around Ukraine. A story with familiar characters and events that play on people's emotions, biases, hopes and fears, to encourage certain types of support, discourage others, and eliminate active opposition. These narratives are often co-creations, selected for their resonance rather than artifice imposed from above. Just as with Kremlin-sponsored disinformation campaigns abroad, The Russian state-affiliated media, with its varied and competing actors vying for popularity and impact, is adept at identifying what resonates and using it to their benefit. The war propagandists know how to attract a crowd and how to impress the Kremlin. They are story makers, not messengers. In the coming chapters, I argue that Russian media content is not the result of the Kremlin imposing a narrative, but of various actors, including ordinary Russians, co-creating a more amenable version of the world around them. To do so, I draw on 10 years of close analysis of Russian state media, data analysis of almost 75,000 posts on the Russian social media platform Telegram, interviews with officials, elites, and ordinary citizens from Russia and Ukraine, and my own experience of living and working in Russia for long periods, researching Russian media, history, and politics. There will be no grand claims about the Russian soul. My purpose in writing this book is to explain why Russians support the war, and what that support actually means in a context almost devoid of political agency. In my efforts to explain this support to the listener, I will use comparisons and analogies with other countries, especially in the West. These are not meant to relativize, but to show where other peoples have faced the same choices and reacted in similar ways. That said, each unhappy country is unhappy in its own way. Russian society is haunted by its unresolved bloody history, the wounds of which the Kremlin reopens constantly, instrumentalizing the trauma of 20th century terror, war, and famine for political gain. Resistance is futile, given that the heirs of the men responsible for all of the terrors, most of the famines, and some of the wars, still run the country, and have instilled a cult of the perpetrator, reinforced by historical myth. Combined with continued authoritarianism lurching into dictatorship, Putin's patrimonial power vertical has created the ideal conditions for a particularly diseased conception of Russian identity to flourish. Treating Putin as the symptom, not the cause, I examine the myths, memories, and myopia fueling the country to disaster, keeping its people clinging to a juggernaut of resentment, insecurity, and fear. Chapter 1. The Bad Tsar. You will upset a lot of people. Vadim Prystaiko, former foreign minister of Ukraine and now the ambassador to the United Kingdom, supported my premise, but had endured enough discussions of Russia's war to forewarn me that my book title wouldn't be popular. Many Western policymakers want to paint this just as Putin's war. It suits them better. The notion that Putin invaded Ukraine despite the Russian people is often espoused by Westerners with a large circle of Russian acquaintances who all hail from an entirely unrepresentative sample of liberal Muscovites. The notion that just one bad Tsar is spoiling the barrel reinforces a reassuring sense that once Putin's generation has died out, the Russian people will trot merrily onto the path of progress, steamrollered forward by a liberal youth who admire and envy the West. I understand the appeal of this narrative, as I would like to believe it too, but it has the disadvantage of being untrue. Russia's war on Ukraine is popular with large numbers of Russians, and acceptable to an even larger number. Naturally, statements like "Russia thinks" are inherently flawed. Russia is a diverse country with diverse people holding diverse views. But most of these people do not oppose the war on Ukraine, and they like Putin, or at least they like what he tells and sells them. To understand the roots of such approval, you need to place yourself in the context in and through which many Russians understand and experience the world. Their perspective is coloured by the trauma of the Soviet collapse, the country's institutions and leaders' refusal to recognise the crimes of the past, and several governments' inability to embed the country within the international rules-based order. Together, these challenges have contributed to an identity crisis and resentment that Putin has been able to channel into a resonant political force. Based on atavism, aggrievement, and aggression, This force acts upon the Russian people in diverse ways that serve the Kremlin's needs. It leaves no space for hope, only revenge. No space for improvement, only redemption. And no space for the future, only a reproducible past in which people can take shelter from the present. People without a past, or who are struggling with identity, often turn to genealogy, buying ancestral DNA kits to understand who they are, where they come from, and to reconnect with the culture of their ancestors. In their past, and in blood relatives whom they never knew, many find a more stable version of themselves. This turn to the past interacts paradoxically with the urge for reinvention or renewal. Rather than embrace the human ability to grow, change and adapt, it is about finding an essence, the source from which we spring, proving we are not fully constructed or imagined. Nations who feel a need to prove their lineage can follow a similar path, tracking down their dead, metaphorically unearthing their forebears to understand who are we by answering who were they. In honouring the dead, using traditions and rituals to connect to them and bring them back to life, nations affirm their own existence and future. In Russia's all-consuming identity crisis, politicians and ordinary people also raise the dead in their search for meaning. But the dead bring no closure, only more deaths. The historian and cultural theorist Alexander Etkind has argued that post-Soviet culture is the land of the unburied, a country where the events of the mid-20th century are still very much alive and still contentious within the political present. Russia's leaders are unable to make sense of the blood-drenched pages of their past, unable to assemble them into a positive story in a way that acknowledges the depth of tragedy. Instead, they ignore or externalize the tragedy, burying it in shallow graves alongside those murdered by the Russian state and its predecessors. On top of these graves, Russian officials and secret services put memorial stones to mask the cause of death, passing off the victims of Stalinist purges as Russians killed by fascists in the Second World War, crudely appropriating the bodies of those they murdered to serve as falsified evidence of their own heroism and victimhood. Such is the process underway in Sandermoch, Karelia, where the local FSB, secret police, insists that the mass graves filled with Stalin's victims, executed during the Great Terror, are actually mass graves of Soviet POWs, slaughtered by Nazis. As well as pursuing local historians, such as Yuri Dmitriev, for providing evidence that disproves their claims, Russian officials are using these victims, many of them Ukrainian writers and artists from the so-called executed Renaissance, as evidence in a campaign to recognize the Second World War as a genocide of the Soviet people. The use of corpses to assert rights over the living isn't peculiar to Russia. When the Yugoslav dictator Josip Broz Tito died, Serbs started to dig up relatives murdered in World War II. In many cases, they hadn't been able to mourn their loved ones, or even acknowledge the ethnocidal nature of their killings. They had to repress their trauma in the name of brotherhood and unity, the maxim of the Yugoslav state. But the exhumations were a reliving rather than resolution of trauma, a grotesque carnival. All of a sudden, it turned out those relatives weren't dead at all. They had come back to life, possessing their children and grandchildren, with all the unresolved tensions of 1941 to 1945, ready to refight past battles. In eerie echoes of Russia's war on Ukraine, Serbia attacked Croatia and Bosnia, recalling their admittedly more significant and recent Nazi collaborator pasts to justify slaughtering erstwhile neighbours and annexing historic Serb lands. At the same time as Yugoslav television camera crews were fixing the screen glare on their film of disturbed graves, 800 miles away, the Berlin Wall was falling. In 1989, Europe's leaders celebrated this new era as a march towards liberalism. But they should have looked south, to see the return and revenge of history. Yugoslavia, so often orientalized as Europe's subconscious or a backwards-looking harbinger of past hatreds, serves rather as a glimpse into Europe's atavistic future. The region possesses histories that the West and Russia alike have preferred to ignore or to violently suppress. In this, Francis Fukuyama was more right than wrong, given that his end of history thesis did not suggest that the countries of the world would sail off into the sunlit uplands of liberal democracy, but rather predicted that countries would find new things to fight over. In the absence of ideology, the source of conflict has become identity, imbued with genealogical essentialism and historicism, a fight over the past for civilizations unable to imagine, let alone provide, a better future. Nowhere have these tendencies been better exemplified than in Russia's war on Ukraine. Both the full-scale invasion and the ongoing conflict waged since 2014. It is obviously an existential war for Ukraine and Ukrainians. Russia's leaders have openly declared their intention to destroy Ukraine as a sovereign entity and identity. The Russian government, having conflated itself with the nation, also sees the war as existential, even if the Russian people do not, on the whole, share this view. As described in the following, Russians occupy a range of positions on the war, with many viewing it as a faraway military operation of which they knew little, at least until the Kremlin's announcement of partial mobilization in September 2022. How to understand this paradox, whereby a war is existential but ignorable? Squaring this circle is crucial to understanding how Russians have come to acquiesce in the crimes committed in their name. The apathy and the extremism stem from the same root of unresolved historical traumas, in which the crimes go unpunished and the criminals stay in power. On its own, this state of affairs prevents the healthy development of society, as we see around the world. But the effect in Russia is exacerbated by the Kremlin's use of historical and other narratives, which reinforces the inherent power and fear of memories for some sections of society, as well as nodding to the resonance of these same memories among other sections of the Russian population. These two sections are not static or divisible. The same person can and often does belong to both, just as many of the NKVD officers who delivered the first waves of Stalin's terror would be executed or sent to the Gulag in later rounds. This indivisibility complicates a tendency in Western thinking to see people living in autocracies as heroes or villains, a binary that overlooks the corrosive nature of fear and how it encourages people to justify their actions. What is more, most Russians have no support structure through which to manage and overcome that fear. The closure of Memorial, a civil society organization dedicated to human rights and the study of Soviet state terror, just a couple of months shy of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, feels retrospectively loaded with symbolism. It completed the state-sanctioned politics of selective amnesia. But fear, amnesia, and negative emotions are not the only drivers. Putin doesn't shape Russians' views on foreign policy or Ukraine so much as he articulates them. The Kremlin has used smoke and mirrors to encourage Russians to support the special military operation, but the Russian people are co-authors of this deception. In other words, the Kremlin's sales tactics are heavy-handed, but many Russians are in the market for buying. As I show in Chapter 2, there is enough sociological research to confirm that a significant number of Russians approve of what they believe is happening in Ukraine. Russians aren't the first nation to support a ghastly and unjust war, and nor will they be the last. So this book wants to look further, asking not if Russians support the war, but why. What does support mean? And to what extent are these phenomena peculiar to Russians? Ultimately, this war does not stem from some genetic Russian exceptionalism, although that would have made for a much easier book to write. It is a choice. From the outside, it may appear a binary choice, but that is not how it is perceived and experienced in Russia. Our quarrel is with the Russian people. In discussions of the war on Ukraine and why it is popular, there are two simplistic streams and a third group of insights. The first categorizes Russians as evil. We need to ban them, destroy their country, and cancel anything they have ever produced. The second group tries to depict the war as Putin's alone, an approach summarized by US President Joe Biden's bizarre line that our quarrel is not with the Russian people. Given how many lethal weapons the USA is sending to Ukraine, it would be terrifying to see them have a real quarrel. The notion that this war is imposed upon the Russian people follows the rhetorical tradition in the West of characterizing the Soviet regime as an evil empire, but its people as long-suffering liberals chafing at the bit of autocracy. Policymakers may view this framing as politically expedient, as if, or when, Putin or Putinism does fall, it allows Russians to externalize his crimes as something done not by, but to them. In theory, this would more easily facilitate a move towards liberalism. But this approach didn't work in 1991. Nor would pretending Russians were in no way complicit be just, and, as the title of this book suggests, it most certainly wouldn't be correct. More importantly, it would reinforce a lack of responsibility and introspection that has contributed to many Russians' inability to accept the truth of the war. This is Russia's war. The Russian people are largely complicit in the war's launch and the way it has been waged, just as the US and UK populations have been complicit in their nation's wars. This book wants to probe that complicity because it is an important part of why and how the war is fought. Putin banked on the population's approval, and he cashed it. Most people had a choice. Russia is an authoritarian country, but until recently, it would not have been correct to categorize it as a dictatorship. It is rather an autocracy that offers its citizens lots of carrots to avoid the stick, as the journalist Joshua Yaffa explains so eloquently in his book Between Two Fires, which spells out the many compromises liberal Russians made to live a meaningful and comfortable existence. It might be useful here to picture what choice you would make in the same position. Would you speak out about a discriminatory company policy if it also meant losing the promotion that would help you afford your son's healthcare? Would you insist on calling the war in Iraq a war crime, even if it carried the threat of jail time? Do you care that much? It is only by posing these questions to ourselves that we can even remotely understand the context in and through which Russians understand the war. Pick your propaganda. Each war-supporting Russian interprets the propaganda in their own way and approves of the war for their own reasons. Very few people simply parrot copycat versions of Kremlin lines. In any country, the same piece of propaganda can produce varied results in audiences. It might mobilize support in some viewers, while in others it will simply spark what the anthropologist Jeremy Morris calls a defensive consolidation. We're here now, so what can we do? Let's stick together. In others still, it will demobilize opposition, either directly, through fear, or indirectly, by encouraging people to disassociate from the war. In research on China, the academic Haifeng Huang found that heavy-handed, over-the-top propaganda actually backfired, in the sense that viewers were less likely to trust and support the narratives and state media producing them. What it did achieve was to make those watching such extreme propaganda less likely to protest, because this propaganda did not, and was not trying to, demonstrate the trustworthiness of the Chinese state. It was a demonstration of the power of the Chinese state, such that it could confidently present such unbelievable lies as news. In other words, propaganda works, but not necessarily in the way you think it does. This is markedly so in Russia, where what one might term support for the war is better understood as an acquiescence born of many factors: apathy, lack of sympathy, self-interest, avoidance of cognitive dissonance, and so on. This is why, if the first half of this book examines what Russians are watching, then the second half switches focus to why they want to watch that in the first place, drawing in more detail on interviews and first-hand analysis of Russian society. Both elements are needed to make sense of Russians' complicated consent to this war. Of the almost 60 interviews I conducted for this book, a discussion with a Russian friend from a normal middle-class Moscow family summed up the complexity for me. In his view, for most Russians, it is natural to care more about a Pushkin statue than a dead Ukrainian child. My parents would say as much, even though they don't really engage with the war. Such things help them to accept the war. It is like an attack on their very being. But he also added that such attitudes were not dependent on age, insisting he had heard similar comments from young people and from people who aren't in Russia. I don't think the location matters. It's the question of belonging to a discourse, a discursive group. Here in Germany I saw some demonstrations of the Alternative for Deutschland, and some Russians with them, bearing Russian flags and singing the Soviet war anthem, Katyusha. It was the day after the discovery of mass graves at Bucha. I wanted to throw a stone at them. But there was no stone, and so he walked on. This quotation visualizes and groups some of the more prominent and frequent reactions of Russians to the war. Those who don't engage with the war, and sometimes may not even support it, but are emotionally consolidated around the Russian side. People who support it by performing certain rituals, albeit rarely with as much agency as the German Russians, noted earlier. And people who are opposed but lack the tools to do anything about it. They have no stone to throw. As I argue throughout this book, one way to understand the difference between the groups, which are imperfectly drawn and in constant flux, is through the spectrum of allies model, used by pressure groups to change minds and influence people. The original spectrum of allies comprises active support, passive support, neutral, passive opposition, and active opposition. Pressure groups and political parties work on the assumption that movements seldom win by overpowering the opposition. They win by shifting support out from under it. Their hypothesis is that, rather than focus on active supporters and active opponents, to change views, you need to acknowledge that most people are somewhere between these 2 points and try to nudge them further along the spectrum of allies. From passive opponent to neutral. From neutral to passive support. From passive support to active support. Likewise, there isn't much point bothering about the active opposition. You won't convince them. It's much more productive to work on moving people up into a more supportive, or at least more neutral category. The Kremlin spectrum of allies functions according to similar principles, but with some adaptations. Their spectrum comprises active support, passive ritual support, loyal neutrals, apathy, and active opposition. Notably, in their version, the Kremlin doesn't just ignore, but sets out to destroy active opposition, or at least render them hopeless and apathetic. Then they nudge the apathetic into loyal neutrality. My country, right or wrong. And loyal neutrals into ritual supporters. A further twist is that the Kremlin does not view active support as the ideal end result, but as undesirable. Distrusting any freely made political act, even if in support of the regime, the Kremlin tries to shuffle active supporters down into the ritual support category, creating clear boundaries for what is and is not an acceptable way to show allegiance. In any authoritarian country with active censorship, ordinary people's views are inevitably difficult to ascertain with full accuracy, which also complicates any generalizations. Whatever the Kremlin wishes to present, Russia is a country of atomization, not of collective coming together. There is no society.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?